Good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the RF Factor, episode number 16. Today, we're going to have the awesome opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Rachel Bolton King. Lately, we've been sort of turning it right over to our guests, how she got here or how they got here. But I know, Pete, that Rachel is near and dear to all the work you've been doing. You've been telling me about her for quite some time based on interactions you've had with her as it relates to whether it's her articles or your own. So I figured maybe I'll just throw this over to you first, because I think you can speak to why it's so important we have Rachel on our show today.
You're right, Ray. You know, I've done a lot of writing in the area of crime gun intelligence, but every piece I've done, I always wind up tripping over pieces that Rachel has done. And as a matter of fact, what Rachel does is she brings an academic perspective. She's sort of sitting up there outside of the law enforcement community, but with a dotted line connected to it. And she's able to see things and make observations that sometimes we don't see for ourselves. So I think it's important that we bring that perspective into our discussions today on crime gun intelligence. She's well traveled. She's done work in the United States. She's toured various labs. She's talked to police officers. She's talked to forensic experts. She's done extensive work in Europe, in the United Kingdom, and other places as well. So we really look forward to hearing her perspective on the issues around crime gun intelligence in terms of the people issues, the process issues, the technology issues, the importance of policy driving these issues, and most importantly, relentless follow-up to make sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing and what they agreed to do. So without further ado, Ray, I'll turn it back to you and we'll get Rachel on board.
So Rachel, welcome aboard. I know you work for Staffordshire University. I said that correct?
Yeah.
But look, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. So my journey started off really as an undergraduate in forensic science in the UK. I always had a passion, like ever since before CSI was a program on television. It was to investigate crime, to use science and experiences to try and problem solve, to try and detect that crime had occurred, investigate it, and hopefully prosecute it. And so that's where my passion for forensic science really began. I thought I always wanted to be a practitioner. And, you know, one of my key drivers really is to actually work with practitioners. You know, I fully appreciate that being a practitioner means that your time isn't always your own, and you have certain priorities that you have to, focus on. And being an academic now, I really value and really want to connect academia and industry better together. And that's kind of been my passion and my ethos really since I did my PhD, which was focused on three-dimensional imaging technologies and specifically in the field of forensic firearm identification. And since then, I started working at Staffordshire University in 2011. I've become a national teaching fellow. I've had the absolute privilege of being awarded a Churchill Fellowship that has enabled me to travel, as Pete mentioned, to really learn from, those on the front line, understand their challenges, their barriers, but also get inspired by how they want to make change and how they hope that change will occur in the future. And so all of the work and the research that I've done since my PhD has ultimately tried to bring my students as an academic to support them in networking with practitioners and giving practitioners extra resources to be able to investigate something that, they might have a gut feeling about, or, they might want to evaluate, or, there's a case scenario that they might not have the resources and the time to do the research on themselves. And so over the last 10, 11 years or so since completing my PhD, I've really sort of focused on supporting, I would hope, supporting practitioners and sharing knowledge and awareness with a whole range of different age groups, both the public, other researchers, practitioners in other countries. And so I've tried to publish when I've had the opportunity to. I always have a lot of research that I've yet to publish on, which I'm trying to make the time for, so that hopefully that gets out into the community, and really try to, I guess, bring all of the aspects of the criminal justice system together. That's really where I think my passion and my drive for change and the future of not only forensic science, but law enforcement and the criminal justice system more broadly. And so all of the work that I'm focusing on doing is about that, and it's fundamentally underpinned by technology, and how, but not just technology, how all of those parts that Pete mentioned, people, processes, technologies, etc., how they can best work together and be most holistic. And so that's where I see sort of my career and my future and my passions for all of us moving forward. And so the Churchill Fellowship and sort of the work that I've been doing, it ultimately, needs academia and industry, I think, to come together much more often, to be better understood by each other, and to help bring all of those parts of the criminal justice system together in that process as well. And so sort of that's my background, how I got into this particular profession. And I started off actually in analytical chemistry, as that's where I thought, drugs analysis might be where my science discipline would go. But as soon as I had the experience of working with people such as Pete and the firearm community, I totally changed, the direction of the discipline in which I wanted to study. And I would never choose to change that moving forwards.
I love your energy and your excitement over this.
So let's set the stage here. There's an old euphemism that says every crime gun has a story to tell. Maybe you could set the stage for our listeners in terms of what forensic story every crime gun may hold.
Yeah, so crime gun intelligence and how the gun can tell a story, and how we can follow that gun in order to lead us to lots of different individuals, lots of different locations, and how we can also link some of those people and those locations together. But I also think, whilst we use this term crime gun intelligence, I think it's really important that we don't forget the really important contribution that ammunition has to the ability for a gun to even become a lethal weapon. And a lot of the focus is on the firearms, and from my sort of interactions with law enforcement and officers, a lot of their attention and focus is often on the gun. But without the ammunition, the firearm can't be discharged, and it can't be used in that lethal way. And
guns don't kill people, bullets kill people.
Absolutely, you're spot on there, Pete. And so, for me, crime gun intelligence isn't just about the firearm, it's about the ammunition. It's about the journey as to where that firearm and that ammunition was created, where it was manufactured, because it's often gets into, the story starts with it being a legitimately owned firearm. But then at some point, that firearm gets into criminal hands, or it gets used for illegal activities. And that at every stage, there can be information and intelligence that can be gleaned generated and exploited for us to be able to understand the story of the gun, the story of the ammunition, and to be able to help us to detect that crime is happening with firearms. Because we often also think about shooting and investigating a shooting or a bloodshed incident. But absolutely every time a firearm is used and ammunition is used, whether it's an actual discharge of a shot or not, whether it's actually using that firearm to elicit fear, to use it as a threat, all of those associated information can actually be used as intelligence. So crime gun intelligence to me is about all the bits of information, all of the journey in which that firearm and that ammunition may be being used or have the potential for being used. And in the context of forensic science, that's really important, often termed forensic ballistics, or, more specifically, forensic firearm identification, to be able to actually associate a fired bullet or a fired cartridge case back to the original source, the firearm that actually discharged it in the first place. And to then also consider the possibility that that firearm may have been used in other crimes, to be able to link or associate those that firearm to be used in those different geographic locations, often by similar people, the same people, or a group of individuals, but also sometimes by completely different individuals through the movement and the trafficking of that particular firearm and the associated ammunition.
Well, it's interesting that you speak about the journey of the firearm and how many firearms that are used in crimes today actually start out as legitimate firearms made by a licensed manufacturer. So speak for a second about the importance of records, accurate records of transfer from the date of manufacture to the maybe a wholesale level or import level, to the retail level, to the ownership level. And you could speak to it because the laws vary so greatly from one city to another, sometimes one state to another, one country to another. Maybe if you could just speak to that, because then I'm going to follow up with a second question about a big problem that we're seeing today in the area of what they call ghost guns. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about the journey and the importance of records and record keeping.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, often we find that there isn't many points of the journey of the firearm in which records are actually kept. So, if they are legitimately manufactured, there are records often kept as to who the purchaser, the organization, the company, or maybe the military, for example, who actually purchased the firearms from the original manufacturer. And then there might be points at which those firearms may have been exported at a border, imported at the next border. There could have been points where they pass from being in the UK, we call it a registered firearm dealer, where it's somebody selling those particular firearms. Then there are records kept as to who may have purchased those firearms, and similarly for ammunition as well. But I know in the US, for example, pawnbrokers are also a great source of information, and some of them are excellent at documenting and keeping records around the transfer of that firearm and the sale of that firearm. Often there isn't many points between when the firearm was originally purchased and when the actual firearm might have been used. But we could also consider the fact that there are documents and records kept if people have their firearms stolen, or if firearms are lost for any reason. Then law enforcement may have records indicating the last point that we were known to have that firearm held legally. And then this being able to document various points in the journey and the life cycle of the firearm is really helpful and vital really for law enforcement and forensic science, because it enables you to narrow down the time frame of which, you know, the firearm might have actually been in use for illegal activities, and the time, what we call time to crime. So the last point of legal holding. And then, you know, it also identifies people that we can talk to as part of the investigation, to see what they last knew, when they last had the firearm, the circumstances in which that firearm may have gone missing, or the point at which they sold it or passed it on to another individual. And all of those points can really help us in the investigative process.
And you know, and I'll just follow up with this one observation, that the extent of record keeping, as you well know, becomes a question of rights, of rights that various countries provide the citizenry in terms of firearm ownership. So we're not making any judgments on that. What we're doing is respecting the laws of every jurisdiction that their citizens ascribe to. And having said that, in the United States, in particular, there is a right to bear arms, and there are laws that prevent quote unquote firearms registration. But at the same time, those same laws recognize the importance of being able to trace the history of a gun that's used in crime. And there are ways to balance record keeping with human rights and the right to bear arms. Some countries don't have those considerations, and there's no judgment there either. I guess the bottom line, the thing I'm trying to say is that you can do both. You could be respectful of the right to bear arms, and you can keep records in a manner that respects that freedom.
Definitely. And, you know, in some respects, you know, you could consider it similar to the same discussions around DNA databases or any other databases that might be utilized for sort of criminal and, you know, investigative purposes. You know, we're not at a stage where everybody in the world's DNA is on a database to use for either, you know, prosecution or elimination purposes. And it's exactly the same from a firearms perspective. You know, even though in my view, a firearm is an object, and most often those that bear arms are using them safely. They use them, you know, in accordance with the law. They use them and possess them legally. And it is unfortunate that the legislation does prohibit typically the legal users of firearms, because as with most things, it's the small minority of people committing illegal activities that then end up causing challenges and stopping others from using firearms in a very safe and responsible manner. You know, DNA, you know, is very personal to each of us as individuals, and if we don't understand how the information about our DNA is put into a database, we can understand how that might impinge our human rights. But in terms of a firearm, it's an object. It doesn't have that same sort of requirement, that's that same personal identifier. And so in some respects, I don't fully understand the rationale behind, you know, not being able to register firearms from a forensic perspective, to obtain a test fire of a firearm, for example, and store that in a database, not containing any personal information about the purchaser or the owner or the user, but about the firearm itself. Registering, the forensic value of that firearm to use for investigative purposes, registering the information around the owner of the firearm, understandably a different matter. But there are two parts of this, which I think, understandably, those that don't work in this field or don't know of all the aspects of this particular part of investigations or legislation or forensic science may not be able to differentiate between. But I do think that there is scope and there is the ability to do both if everyone has the understanding and the awareness about actually what purpose it has and what value it could have for them as individuals as well as the wider society.
I know exactly the issue that you're talking about in terms of sort of taking a fingerprint of somebody at the time they're born to see later on if they committed a crime. And I've been involved in the technology that would be used to do this, what we call ballistic fingerprinting. But having said that, I see that in some places it can work and work very well. And some countries have put that in place. But there's really a balancing act, because in some countries, depending on the scope of firearms usage and new firearms that are coming into the community pool, it really comes down to what is cost effective, what makes sense. There are some places that if somebody asked me, I'd say, no, all of the effort to do that may not be worth what you would get out of it. But at the same time, are there surgical things we can do for, like, stolen weapons, for example? If a weapon becomes stolen and there was an exemplar, could that then be entered into a system to track the stolen use? So unfortunately, whenever this gets discussed in a political vacuum, it's always the big issue, the most complicated one, when in reality, there may be surgical things you can do that make sense instead of global things that you can do to make sense. So I get it. I get it. And I find myself on both sides of that issue, depending on who we're speaking to. So
and I mean, there's a whole range of complexities and issues.
Like Australia, for example. Australia did a study and some years back, and they found that the source of their crime guns was actually private security firms that were authorized to have firearms. And the guns were either being stolen or robbed directly from the security officers, or they were being unlawfully diverted under the table to the criminal element. So they did put a law in place that licensed armed security companies and required an exemplar of every gun that they had in their inventory. And they were solving bank robberies and knowing what gun did it before the private security realized that they were missing the gun that was involved. So it worked for them.
But it has to be proportional, doesn't it?
It has to be proportional. I think that's what you're saying. And I'm gonna ask Ray where we need to go, because
I'm actually I'm excited just sitting back and listening. But Rachel, one area that I would sort of like to spend a little bit more time on, and has to do with people, the human factor, and doing some research about you prior to us setting up today for this recording. I came across an interview, and you were talking about your research, and in one component was the importance for juries to understand the value of forensic evidence. Now, I have found in my own career that it's just not the jury that sometimes is challenged by forensic evidence and, of course, forensic technologies, but it's also law enforcement in general, meaning police, investigators, all the way up to the command level. And just by you shaking your head, I think you probably identify with that. So, taking us down that road here, while it's critically important that juries understand this, and well, let me back up. Let me give it a little context. You know, this is something that we've all become familiar with over the last probably 10 years is the CSI effect. What people see on TV is what they really think forensics are. Some of that is becoming accurate, but not all of it. So what can we do, starting with law enforcement, starting with the police, investigators, all the way up to command staff, executives, so they recognize there is a tremendous value in spending time and attention in forensics and forensic technologies, and then of course, how do we follow up on that? And what I mean by that is there, and this is where this relentless follow-up piece it comes up, and hence the name of our show is that you always have to be looking in your rearview mirror, because just because you got it right today doesn't mean 3 or 4 years from now, when there's turnover and just human slippage in general, forces us to go back and ensure that folks understand these concepts and are able to leverage these concepts. Because to your point earlier with you and Pete describing this, that it's critically important not only for the justice system, but it's also effective and efficient if you're relying on forensics. So I'd love you to weigh in on that.
Absolutely. And actually it also ties in with some of the work that I've been doing in the UK recently, because, absolutely the juries and the CSI effect, and latest research has even demonstrated that depending on who you ask, which areas of the world, which specific members of the public and what their background knowledge and awareness are, their interpretation of and their assessment of the value of forensic science in decision making, it differs. And this is totally true as well in law enforcement. And some of the work that I've been doing has definitely identified some of the challenges around understanding forensic evidence, understanding what it's capable of providing, what its limitations are. And this isn't just in the context of, firearms and gun crime. This is in the much broader sense of forensic science. People are much more aware and of the potential value of fingerprints and finger mark evidence and DNA evidence. Not necessarily completely accurately, but they're much more aware. If you compare the US and the UK, for example, with the civilian background knowledge and awareness of firearms, in the UK, our awareness of it is much more limited.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean to say that in the US everybody understands it either. And so it just at a baseline level as a civilian, before you even think about becoming a law enforcement officer or, a forensic practitioner or a judge or, anybody within the judicial system, the background knowledge and awareness of the individual is paramount. And I mean, within law enforcement, they have a whole field of knowledge that has to occupy their brain and their space, regarding legislation and policies and procedures and, for a whole range of different types of crime, not just gun crime. And so it's completely understandable that to ask them to then understand the scientific underpinning of how forensic evidence can add value to them, and whether it's a technology related thing or even a report that says this is a forensic outcome or this is a link between this crime and this crime. Actually, it's our job as forensic experts to actually communicate what we know and what the value of it is, because, you know, we don't understand all the aspects of law enforcement and investigation. So how can we possibly expect them to understand everything as well? But there needs to be better and more mutual understanding of the two, because from a law enforcement perspective, you know, whatever level of seniority you are, or whether you're, you know, on the ground as an officer who's just joined a police force, you know, just gone through training, one of the key fundamental aspects that we've identified from work in the UK is that there is no, or there's incredibly limited training, and whether it's awareness training or any form of training around forensic evidence and what it can do, what its limitations and its capabilities are. And that's at, you know, ground, you know, at entry level. But then there's nothing above that either. Or if there is, it's ad hoc, it's delivered in-house, it's not necessarily delivered by experts in the field. You know, it might be just experience-based knowledge that's passed on from one person to the next. And as you said, when turnover happens, you know, that knowledge, that awareness has gone. You might have law enforcement agencies that have dedicated task teams that, you know, very much focus and specialize on investigating particular type or types of crimes that are often associated with each other. And this is often where the best outcomes might occur. However, everyone involved, you know, preceding those people coming to the scene or being part of that investigation, or if the crime itself isn't severe enough to warrant that level of input, there's a whole wealth of lack of knowledge, lack of awareness. And, you know, we have to develop more CPD based frameworks that embed forensic evidence and, you know, what forensic evidence can do to an investigation. We've got to embed that in there all the way through, and not just at one level or another. You know, it's a constant developmental process, which means that over the course of your career, your knowledge and your awareness and your understanding advances, and it changes as, you know, the situation around you changes, as the research develops, as the technology develops. And therefore the follow-up has to, you know, be continual, you know, so that that knowledge and awareness, that understanding is constantly being developed, you know, relatively frequently, you know, every year, couple of years, not every 5 years or never. But also, you know, from the flip side, forensic scientists, you know, we don't necessarily do our job well either. We don't enable our reports to get back to officers in a timely manner. And so how can they possibly think that forensic evidence is of value and useful to them if they're getting it a week later, 2 weeks later, a month, 2 months, a year later? That's no use to them whatsoever. So you can understand why they don't necessarily have strong confidence or value in the forensic evidence either.
Can I just be, I know Pete had his hand up, but just to that point, there's a mindset that there should be a separation between law enforcement and forensics. And from an evidentiary perspective, I certainly agree with that. But I'm wondering if folks have taken that to a degree where that separation means that those two communities don't talk. And because they don't talk, they don't pass on information, and they're not able to learn from each other. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one, because on the one hand, I agree that, you know, to some extent, there needs to be separation between law enforcement and forensic science, but not even, you know, from an agency perspective. I actually think, you know, some of the best approaches and best timeliness, effectiveness, and efficiency come by geographically locating the actual forensic laboratory with the law enforcement agency that directly will utilize or most often utilize their outcomes, their reports. But I think the challenge is that human factor. It's that that perception that the closer that law enforcement and forensic science become, the more potential there is to introduce bias into the analysis, into the decision making, into the overall investigation. And so from my perspective, and this is my opinion, and there will be people who disagree with me, and there's also research that disagrees with me, but there's also a research that agrees with me, that actually it's about the human involvement, and it's about the policies and the procedures that are in place to eliminate the information that is not necessary for the forensic analysis and interpretation to be done. But there has to be really strong, close relationships and working, communication methods between forensic scientists and law enforcement, because without them, nothing happens. Without them, the forensic scientists don't know what they're analyzing. They don't know what to do because they need to be informed. But then if there's no sort of feedback to them, if there's no link back into law enforcement, or that mechanism is broken or it's not well developed, again, whatever they do in the lab, however amazingly it's done, it's not going to be utilized. So there was kind of no point in it being, undertaken in the first place. And so
it's what you're describing, I believe, is, the old adage that there's a time for every purpose, a time for every season. And there's a time when forensic experts and law enforcement people need to be talking together and working together. And there's a time for them to be separated and leave a clear cut a line of demarcation between them. And common sense needs to balance that, because to your original point about knowledge and educating each other from the law enforcement side and the forensic side about what the needs are on the law enforcement side, what the value that they can provide on the forensic side, that those discussions need to take place not once, not basic in your initial training, but an ongoing reinforcing type of thing where we keep up with the changes in technology and forensics. And what I've seen in my workshops, I would in the United States, there's NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. In the UK, there's NABIS, the National Ballistic Intelligence section and service. And in my workshops, I give an introduction into NIBIN, and at the break, at one of the lunch breaks, I ask everyone, tell the truth. How many of you knew what NIBIN was before you walked into this workshop? And if there were 100 people in the workshop, I might see 10 hands go up. Mm-hmm. And so your point exactly about this then at the beginning, that there's a time for that purpose. It's a rightful purpose. And then your point about this line of separation so we don't have implicit bias, that's a rightful purpose. And so we've got, it's like anything else in life when you're dealing with human beings, we've got to balance and do what makes sense to get to our goal. Because while we may be on separate tracks, a forensic track and an investigative track, we're both going towards the same objective, to identify the criminal and bring them to justice.
Exactly. And and it's the same around the judicial part of the system. It doesn't matter which part of, whether you're looking at rehabilitation and the prison service, whether you're looking at forensic science, whether you're looking at law enforcement and legislation, and every single part of that chain is fundamental to being able to investigate crime, prosecute crime, ensure that individuals aren't wrongfully prosecuted, and also to try to reduce crime, in the future for society, reduce harm and violence for society. But every single part of that chain has to work as effectively and efficiently as the other. There are understandably challenges at each of those points, but if one part of the chain is doing an amazing job, but it's being let down by some other part of the chain, then that one part that's continuing to improve and advance and be more effective, more efficient, innovative, really push the boundaries of what's possible, it's not going to have the impact that it should. And those people are going to be working so hard, but they're not going to have the change that actually that deserves to happen, not only for them, but also for society. And so it's really important, I think, that the whole criminal justice system actually has to take a look at itself from a really wide, holistic viewpoint. But we often, because of the time parameters and our job and our resourcing, etc., we focus on our individual role at our point of that journey, of that cycle, of that chain. But actually, I think if we came together much more often, all parts of the criminal justice system, in order to change our policies, our procedures, our practices, and understand the barriers, the challenges that each part of it faces, we wouldn't then be, blaming one part of the chain or the other for miscarriages of justice or, low crime solving rates, really difficult, violent, social and community environments. But you have to have people in all of those places at quite senior levels willing to come together, willing to find consensus, willing to change and to challenge and to make effective and timely and vital changes that are needed. They have to be able to consider everybody's viewpoint and be able to create a holistic solution to the criminal justice system, because this is, I think, why even in one country we've got some laboratories, some law enforcement agencies, some regions that are being brilliant, but for whatever reason that is not being consistently adopted and shared and enacted across the whole nation. And I can say that even in the UK, which is a really small geographic space, on the same hand, we have the same problem in the US, and where it's understandably more challenging because there are more agencies, there's more borders, and barriers than there are in the UK. And if we can't even do it easily in the UK, how on earth could you possibly do it in a country as big as South Africa or the US?
So that's a great segue into, from your global perspective, as it relates to processes and practices, not everyone can get them all in, as you've described. They might not be resourced appropriately. Maybe their capabilities aren't there. But as it relates to crime gun intelligence, forensics related to crime guns, what do you feel is maybe your top three that an entity, regardless of where they sit globally, needs to ensure that they master?
I think really good relationships between all of the actors within the criminal justice system. Understanding, that there needs to be those separations at various points, but to be able to connect and to share and to liaise and to communicate the knowledge and, the outcomes back to each other, I think is one of the most fundamental things. I think ultimately, it doesn't matter what processes, what technology you have or don't have, if you don't value the people, if you don't reward them for their success, if you don't have consequences if they don't do what they're supposed to do, if you don't create a fair and empowering working environment. I've seen, even within the same country, 2 different laboratories, they're supposed to undertake the same policies, the same practices, yet the working environment of the people and how they feel that they're treated, or the environment in which they feel they're working in one place versus another, means that actually those in the place that they don't feel valued, where they don't feel that what they're doing is worthwhile, the time and the effort they're putting in, if they don't understand what contribution they're making to criminal justice outcomes, then they're demotivated. They don't want to come to work. They don't want to put in that extra mile because they're not feeling like it's needed, or they don't know why they would have to do that. Whereas in another laboratory where they are supported, where they feel like a family, where the extra time that they put in is appreciated and they're rewarded for that. And I don't mean financially rewarded. I just mean, within your soul, you feel, and if you have ideas, you feel like you're able to air them and pursue them. And it creates empowerment, it creates innovation. And that's what you want within your workforce. Yes, you can put all these policies and procedures and technologies in place, but if you don't have the right people with the right mindset to use them, or have the desire and the motivation to carry them out properly, all of that money that you put in with technology, or all that change in process and procedure, if no one follows them, then that's more pivotal, more critical to, not being able to make change. So I think my first one would be, building good working relationships within departments and between them, to ensure that the work that's being done is utilized, and that there's getting feedback to each of the different parts of that chain so that they understand each other. The second would be around understanding what data exists within the laboratory, within the property management store, within the police, computers. What information do we already have about crime guns, about gun crime, about how firearms and ammunition are illicitly used? And we need to maximize that data. We need to analyze it properly. And I think there needs to be more training and awareness and understanding around intelligence analysis and all of the software that might be utilized, not only expensive software, but free software, and training provided, so that those individuals, whether they're law enforcement, whether they are intelligence analysts, whether they're forensic scientists, they can actually analyze and interrogate, and they have time to do that, to be able to exploit the knowledge that they already have about emerging threats, areas where they may not have had much gun crime before, but they're starting to ramp up. So I think that would be my second one, around more training and awareness generally, but particularly in the use of forensic intelligence, and how it can support both investigations, but also trying to prevent crime from occurring. And then my third one would be around trying to dispel the myth that expensive technology is the only solution. It isn't. Absolutely, though, I 100% agree. Technology helps, particularly if you have high levels of gun crime, particularly if you have any type of firearm related crime. And this means, manufacturing of illegal firearms. So whilst that might not be something that's occurring in the US very often because of the availability of factory made manufactured firearms. In the UK and across Europe, our firearm legislation is much more severe, and now we are experiencing in the UK craft produced firearms. We've always had our criminals have always liked to get around our legislation, find loopholes, use antique weapons, and make homemade ammunition so that they can discharge them and say that they've got a legally possessed firearm for their criminal activities. Whether it's ghost guns, whether it's 3D printed guns, whether it's literally two pieces of pipe being pushed together to fire a shotgun cartridge. The illegal manufacturing of ammunition and firearms, you just if the knowledge and awareness isn't there that is happening, or that might be occurring when you have execute a warrant, when you go and do a search, if you aren't aware of actually what these pieces of equipment might look like that indicate illicit manufacturing facilities, that's firearm related crime too. And that's sometimes the starting point. You might go into a property or a residence and you might have overlooked that information. So being able to understand the value that a whole range of different types of firearm related crime exist, and making use of the technology and the free software or the available hardware that you have. Just because it's old doesn't mean that it's not valuable, it's not useful, that you can't utilize that information, the images you take from the comparison microscope. There might be an academic in the university down the road who can actually write you a piece of software that enables you to do something that you don't have the financial resources to buy for you. And so, it's about, making those connections and being able to reach out to people who may be able to assist to bridge some of the barriers and tackle the barriers that you might be experiencing, particularly if the financial restrictions are such that you can't do what some other places are able to do.
So this has been very, very insightful, and I find myself mesmerized by what you're saying. We're running up against our hour, and I think that we'd like to have you come back and talk about some of your actual research at some point. But as we move to close out this session, Rachel, you're in charge. You're the president. You're the king, the queen for the day. What would you do if you were in charge today to improve the use of crime gun intelligence?
Oh, you're not going to like this answer. I'd scrap it all. I would literally get some of the key stakeholders together, but making sure that every single professional role involved in the criminal justice system is in that workshop, a massive workshop. And we would start with a completely blank slate. And we would consider what the current issues are and what we consider the future issues to be associated with crime. And not just gun crime, because we know that that's only one part. And it's often associated, firearms are often associated with other forms of illegal activity. So we need to consider this as a holistic perspective, not just investigating one type of crime or, the commodities associated with that type of crime. We need to consider the fundamental picture of what crime is and will be in the future, and try to work together to identify how we can make the processes, the practices, the policies, and use our resources, financial, person power, space, facilities, everything as effectively as we actually can. And because we often find when we make the change, in the short term, it's really painful and it may feel like there's no, improvement that's going to be made. But if it's done properly, there's always efficiencies, always effectiveness. You create resources, you create time, you enable things to happen that you never thought possible if you stayed in the mindset that you were. And so that's what I would do. I would consider the entire thing as ground zero. Our society now is not what it was when a lot of our laws and our agencies and our laboratories were created. The knowledge that we have now is so much more advanced than it was back then, and we are limiting ourselves, by sometimes understandably only taking those small points and making small changes. But I think we need to have a complete paradigm shift in our approach to the criminal justice system. But everybody had to be on board in order to make that happen. Even if the president was to say this is happening, if there's not buy-in at the ground level, if they don't understand why they're doing it, again, no change is going to happen.
So if I hear you right, we've got to stop trying to change the flat tire on the car while we're running down the highway at 60 miles an hour. And sometimes you got to stop, take a step back, stand down, and reevaluate from ground up.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Ray.
Hey, Rachel. We Pete and I'd like to consider the RF Factor a podcast that focuses on leadership. And since we've been doing this, I recognize that I constantly get it wrong as it relates to leadership. There's no one size that fits all. It comes in all shapes and sizes. And I'm of the mindset that when it comes to leadership, you know it when you see it. And clearly you are a leader. And I really enjoyed listening to your, not just description, but your understanding of forensic intelligence, and more importantly, what it is about to be a leader in this domain. So thank you for spending this past hour with us. It was very informative, and I'm looking forward to some of the other things you're going to be doing into the future on how you, to Pete's point, on how you figure out a better way to change the tire here.
Your passion is contagious, really.
Yes.
Thank you. But I'm just one part. I can't do anything without a whole team of people, working with the same agenda, with the same vision, and wanting that change for us all for the future.
Before we close, we do have to ask you about that beautiful picture behind you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it, because I know any of our guests that are going to catch this on YouTube will be wondering.
Absolutely. So the picture behind me is by an artist called Paul Kenton in the UK. It was one of the first pieces of art that I bought when I bought my own house. And so it captures my imagination because it's both purposeful but also abstract. And I'll move out the way so you can actually see it. He uses a screwdriver to actually drizzle the paint over and make the detail that you can see. And Mini was my first car, and I had a number of them over the years. I am a motorsport fanatic. I have a 1932 MGM type, which I was bouncing for my dad at the weekend in one of his vintage cars. It's just a 1936 MG Cream Cracker.
Do you wear one of those helmets too? Do you put them on?
Oh, luckily I'm not behind the racing, on a track. When I am on a track, though, I'm in orange. I'm a marshal, so I stand on the start line or I run the assembly area. So
very cool. Love it.
Very
yes.
cool.
Yes. Well, Rachel, we can't thank you enough for coming on. And to Pete's point, we're going to have you back on in the future.
Fantastic. Well, thanks.
We want to get a little more deeply into some of your research, and but this was a good foundation we've established. So for the next time,
look forward to it. Thanks, Bo.
Thank you so much.